This is the second of two talks on the historical foodways in early colonial Eastern North America. I earlier gave two short stories or vignettes, one on the Spanish colonists in South Carolina from the early to the mid-16th century, and the other on British colonists in coastal Virginia during the early 17th century. Today, I'd like to talk about French colonists in Louisiana during the 18th century, British colonists at Charleston also during the 18th century, and the effects of colonization on South Carolina Indian diet between the 16th to the 18th centuries. And these are all stories about colonial encounters between different peoples. Each of these stories presents several viewpoints, including people's beliefs about what constitutes food, talking about foodways, or food in a social and cultural setting, or food's effect on the body, on people, and food identity, and colonialism, somewhat from both sides of the coin. The first story today is about the French in 18th century Louisiana, and why did the French in New Orleans value local foods and incorporate them into their cuisine? In the second story, the British settlement of Charleston in 1670 led to many introductions of favored foods. In the final story, South Carolina Indians in the 16th to 17th centuries, I ask, how did they choose which introduced foods to incorporate into their traditional diets? The earliest French to encounter Indians along the Mississippi River were missionaries and fur traders who entered the area via the Great Lakes in the 1600s. These early missionaries and fur traders lived in native villages and ate the native food, and the fur traders were famous for living with Indian women, married or not. But after the founding of New Orleans in 1718, French farmers began to settle the so-called Upper Louisiana in the 1700s, and they became the breadbasket supplying maize, meaning corn, and wheat to New Orleans. So French colonial settlement in the early 1700s along the Mississippi and Illinois rivers occurred in what is now the states of Illinois and Missouri, otherwise known as Upper Louisiana. This area was administered by New Orleans. The French colonial policy was to physically separate French and native settlements, which at this point in time led to paired towns, a French town and nearby an Indian town. Already by the 1700s, maize had been introduced to Europe, and the poor in France were eating gruel made from maize. And otherwise, maize in France was used to feed pigs and poultry. The settlers of Upper Louisiana made an effort to separate themselves culturally from the Indians, even though they allowed Indian women to marry into French society there, and these Indian women adopted French dress and French customs. Although these households depended on domesticated animals that had been brought by the French for meat, they continued to supplement their diet with wild game, and they liked the wild game. In their gardens, they grew a mixture of introduced and native vegetable crops. Their sticking point appears to have been wheat bread. These wealthy settlers in Upper Louisiana preferred wheat bread. Maize was fit to be served only to slaves and boatmen, and also was exchanged to the Indians. Turning now to New Orleans, food figured prominently and consciously in the mediation of the colonial encounter in New Orleans in the 18th century. Practices enunciate a hierarchy of taste that positively valued exotic native resources while showing how easily they could be civilized by French cooking practices. Politics of pleasure and hospitality were vital to French native interactions and to the reconstruction of Frenchness in the colonial capital of New Orleans. The French military officer Bossu spoke on the necessity of accepting food offered by native hosts, that this was good etiquette. During one visit, he says, I was brought persimmon bread, bear paws, and beaver tails. I also ate dog, though not through preference, but in order not to offend my hosts. I have made it a point to conform to the customs of the people with whom I have to live, and to assume their habits in order to gain their friendship. The politeness required of reciprocal hospitality provided a catalyst for the exchange of food ideas and the rapid adoption of new items. Such exchanges occurred in multiple directions. So the French, unlike the British, were open to trying all of the local Indian foods. Some of the foods were valued as local equivalents of European foods, and others were savored for their exotic appearance and wild taste. The colonists took pride in their ingenuity in adopting local resources and molding them into something familiar by cooking them using French preparation methods. New World cooking ingenuity became an emblem of colonial accomplishment, that is, the ability to transform America into something civilized and consumable. Doughty summarizes a number of points. 1. Colonists actively adopted native foods while constructing the taste experience as both strange and pleasurable. 2. Simultaneously, they attempted to transplant French foods and habits into their new American environment. 3. Their descriptions invoke a comparison between wild local Indian and domesticated imported French, to the neglect of interlacing their foods with the African slaves that they also had in New Orleans. Exotic ingredients were tamed through traditional French recipes such as breads, pâtés, and fricassees. And hospitality customs were important for the exchange of cultural food practices between Native Americans and Europeans, and for the social bonding of French colonizers, particularly in New Orleans. The second story I'll tell today, a very short one, is on the British settlement of Charleston in 1670. Now, explorers from England were first going along the South Carolina coast looking for a place to establish Charleston, resulting in over a dozen translated accounts, letters, or advertising pamphlets about South Carolina between the dates of 1664 and 1712. These provide crucial information for untangling the complex introductions and reintroductions of European plant crops into South Carolina. And all of these crops did not necessarily come from England, but they had already moved from other countries to England and from England to South Carolina. Between 1670 and 1712, the colonists in Charlestown planted numerous introduced tree and vine, fruits or nuts, herbs, vegetables such as potatoes, grains such as rice, oats, rye, barley, and wheat, pulses, tobacco, and other staples such as hemp, flax, cotton, and indigo. I list here some of the most common fruit trees introduced by the British settlers, and the dates shown are the dates in which they occur in the historic records. And three of these are of particular importance, three of these dates, 1664, 1666, and 1670. And these all predate the settlement of Charleston. So they're talking about peach and fig being here prior to British settlement. Where did they come from? Because they are not from the Americas. They also mention other imported fruit, not nearly so often, between 1682 and 1712. Now, the early colonists of Charleston ate a mixture of domesticated, that is, introduced crops, domesticated animals, especially cows and hogs, and wild game and fish, shellfish. Both documents and zooarchaeology agree that Low Country residents consumed a wide range of animals throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, in writing home from Charleston in 1691, John Boyd described the flavor of bear and tigers, meaning wildcat, as well as stags and wild turkeys. From 1712 to 1750, wild game constituted 45% of meat in the Charleston diet, and this was especially composed of fish and turtles. Wheat and barley did not grow well here, so Charlestonians had to rely on maize initially, but after several decades of occupation, of course, rice became important. The final story is about the South Carolina Indians between the 16th to the 18th centuries, and how did their multiple colonial encounters affect their diet. Between 1515 and 1715, when the Spanish, French, and British were vying for control of South Carolina, local Indians were forced into making choices about which of their traditions were important or expedient to maintain. The Spanish were along the coast of South Carolina between 1515 to 1587, and even reached into the interior of South Carolina between 1540 and 1628. The French explored the coast in the 1524 and had a brief colonization in 1562. The British began exploration in 1663 and colonization at Charlestown in 1670. And even other Indians then began arriving thanks to political maneuvering by the Spanish and the English. So the Spanish and the British were both trying to create a boundary along the Savannah River between the British-controlled territory to the north and the Spanish-controlled territory from Georgia to the south. And one of the Indian groups that they brought in were the Westo Indians, who were there between 1659 to 1680. And I put their names down as representing the many different Indian tribes who came and went along that contested border. So foodways are not easily changed. When the Europeans came to North America, they brought with them deliberately new plant foods, domesticated animals, but also unconsciously brought with them animal fodder, crops, and weeds. Some plants became weeds and spread on their own. Some plants were passed from one Indian nation to another. Initially, domesticated animals from the Europeans were not adopted by the Indians. Each of the different European nations who came had different plant sources. So the Spanish had already been exploring in South America, the Caribbean, and Mesoamerica. So they brought plants from South America, Caribbean, Mesoamerica, Florida, the Southwest, and Europe. Whereas the British had strong ties with the West Indies, and in particular Barbados, and the Jamestown colony in Virginia, as well as England, of course. So plants were already grown by local Indians prior to Euro-American contact, and they had obtained plants through direct trade with Euro-Americans, or plants through down-the-line trade with Euro-Americans, or plants escaped from Euro-American cultivation, and plants also brought, perhaps, we don't know, by colonizing Indians. Now, the South Carolina Indians experienced dietary changes before the arrival of Europeans. During the late Woodland, or AD 500 to 950, here in South Carolina, wild nuts such as hickory and acorn were important in the plant diet, supplemented with some maize and squash. For meat, venison and wild turkey were very important, along with a variety of other types of animals that were captured, such as turtles, for example. In the early Mississippian, AD 950 to 1300, white-tailed deer continued to be an important source of meat, along with elk in places where elk were, and bear. They grew the crops of maygrass, quinipod, and maize. Some of these perhaps are strange to you, but they were important domesticates here in eastern North America. And they continued to gather wild nuts, especially acorn and then hickory. And by the late Mississippian, AD 1300 to 1700, the period during which they first encountered Euro-Americans, they were growing maize with still growing a little bit of maygrass or quinipod, and were eating yet an even greater variety of wild nuts, and still depending upon white-tailed deer, turkey, and so forth, the same sorts of meats. In 1682, to advertise the English colony at Charlestown, Thomas Ashe wrote about the Indians, "Their diet is of fish, flesh, and fowl, with Indian maize or corn, their drink water. There was rapid Euro-American population growth in South Carolina between 1670 to 1682. When Charlestown was first settled in 1670, there were less than 150 British colonists. By 1 year later, nearly 400. And by 38 years later, 4,000 settlers. By 1710, 12% of the population along the coast of South Carolina were Euro-Americans, 22% were black slaves, and 66% were Indians. And nearly all the Euro-Americans were simply right along the coast on streams or tidal inlets between the Santee River and Edisto River. Based on recovered archaeological plant remains between 1640 and 1715, Indians along the South Carolina coast and far into the interior continued traditional reliance on their own crops and wild plants, such as maize, maypop, persimmon. So what European introduced crops did Indians choose to adopt? Gramion has written about this. She said they chose crops that tasted good but weren't critical to the diet. That is, a crop that didn't initially supply a major portion of calories. A crop that could be grown and cooked in ways already familiar to the adopter. And a crop that didn't conflict with other important scheduled duties. What crops were these? Well, in general, the crops adopted the earliest were watermelon, peach, and cowpea. And all three of these were brought to the coast of South Carolina by the Spanish in the early 1500s. These plants may have been adopted by the South Carolina Indians and spreading inward without direct contact with the Spanish. How can I say this? Well, when the British came looking for where to put Charlestown, they started down at the Port Royal area and then moved northward, further away from the Spanish. But their descriptions in 1664 of the Port Royal area said that the country abounds with grapes, large figs, and peaches. Well, grapes were certainly native to South Carolina, but figs and peaches had been introduced by the Spanish. And yet by this point, the Spanish had been out of the area for about 70 years. So 70 years after the Spanish left Santa Elena, there were still groves of figs and peach trees growing wild along the South Carolina coast. In describing an Indian town on Paris Island, Sanford said, "I saw here, beside the great number of peaches, which the more northerly places do also abound in, some store of fig trees, very large and fair, both fruit and plants." In talking about St. Helena Island, Carteret said, "Many of us went ashore at St. Helena and brought back word that the land was good land, supplied with many peach trees and a competence of timber, a few fig." So fig had been introduced by the Spanish via Santa Elena, and the fig seeds had been recovered from Santa Elena, dating between 1577 to 1587. And as you've just seen, they were growing wild in the area as late as 1664 to 1666, before British settlement and after Spanish settlement. Now, the colonists also brought in figs when they settled Charlestown. The peach also had been introduced by the Spanish and has been recovered from Santa Elena, dating between 1577 to 1587. And down in Florida, it was very common in Spanish missions after 1560. I can speak from experience that peach is a very weedy tree that spreads easily, and after planting a seed, in 3 to 5 years, you will actually have fruit on the tree. And here among these pictures of peaches, you'll see a peach pit from a site just outside of Charleston that predated the settling of Charleston. And so here was peach prior to the British settling. And obviously, it's my belief that the Indians adopted peach without ever having to directly contact the Spanish, but they simply found those wild groves of peaches left over from Spanish occupation. And cowpea also had been introduced by the Spanish. It's been found also at this site just outside of Charleston. dating from 1590 to 1670, and by 1670 it's already in central Alabama and in eastern Tennessee by the late 1700s. Watermelon, which was introduced by the Spanish to South Carolina, by 1597 is mentioned as growing in Georgia, and by the late 1500s it was grown in the Southwest, where the Spanish also settled. And by the early 1600s it was being grown both in Europe and the West Indies, and by the 1600s grown along the Mississippi River south of the Great Lakes. So what well-established Indian food was the preparation of peaches based on? Initially, I thought perhaps it was based on wild plums, which were native here. But then again, we frequently do find burnt peach pits, and we rarely find burnt plum pits. So I wondered, well, they're not being fixed the same way. And I came to realize that I think that they were mimicking the ways in which they prepared persimmons for food. And persimmons, you could squeeze out the seeds and then make a fruit leather and keep your fruit for much longer out of season in that manner. To summarize, based on recovered plant remains between 1640 to 1715, Indians along the South Carolina coast and far into the interior continued traditional reliance on their own crops and wild plants, despite all the colonial activities from various nations and also invading Indians. But they supplemented their diet with weedy or easily grown introduced domesticates, such as peach. It appears that changes in the types of plant foods were minor among these early colonial Indians. However, it's likely that the seasonal timing associated with plant cultivation and collected, or the emphasis on what was grown or collected, and even ratios of dietary plant food items would have changed. And we cannot assume that meat in the diet remained the same. After all, one of the activities that the Indians began to engage in after the arrival of the British or even I think perhaps during the arrival of the Spanish, was a trade in furs and deerskins. Based on historic documents, like the Spanish before them, the earliest British colonists along the South Carolina coast depended on Indian crops, particularly maize. They acquired plant foods from local Indians, and they imported plants from Virginia. They grew other non-local crops that they'd introduced, and they received supplies of other non-local crops, mostly from Barbados, if not from Jamestown. So during the earliest colonial period, when it came to plant foods, Indian knowledge appears to have affected Europeans much more than European foods affected Indians.